welcome back to lecture number 2 in our central nervous system unit. Lecture number 1 was about reflexes. So those are responses that have to happen really, really quick. Remember, they bypass the brain. So maybe you touch something hot, your sensory neuron's going to take that to a spinal cord. In the spinal cord, remember, that's the integration center. There might be one or more interneurons in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. If there is not, if it's a direct connection between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, remember, that's a monosynaptic or a simple reflex. And if there's are interneurons in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, that'll be a polysynaptic reflex. Well, today we're going to learn some new stuff. Learning objective number 2. Identify and indicate the functions of major regions of what's called the cerebral hemispheres. All right, so this is right here. Here's your cerebrum. It's the largest part of the brain. So this entire wrinkly area, all this, that's your cerebrum. And there's different cerebral hemispheres. So there's a right cerebral hemisphere and there's a left cerebral hemisphere. We'll go barely into the diencephalon, basically just what it is, where it's located. Barely into the brainstem and barely into the cerebellum. So today is mostly about the cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres. All right, make sure you're taking some notes and make sure you're listening and watching, because some of the questions are going to be things that I say but are not necessarily written anywhere. All right, so just some general characteristics of the brain. It's wrinkled like a walnut. So you can see here the cerebrum right here. It's wrinkled, so it's got some high spots like right here, and it's got some little grooves or valleys like right there and right here. So it looks kind of like a walnut, a very big walnut. It's located in the cranial cavity. Remember, so the dorsal cavity is along the back that contains the cranial cavity where the brain is, and also the vertebral or the vertebral cavity where the spinal cord is located. So remember, both those combined as the dorsal cavity, but the brain is specifically located in the cranial cavity. Weighs about 3 pounds. Don't know if you'll need to know that. It's considered fully developed or formed by age 25. So most of you guys in high school, your brain is still developing. Brain sizes varies. I didn't know this. Men have larger brains than women. Didn't know it. It holds about 150 milliliters of blood and also 150 milliliters of CSF or cerebrospinal fluid. It contains roughly 86 billion neurons. I've seen different numbers. I've seen 100 billion. I've seen 130 billion. I don't know what the right answer is. Just know it's a lot. It's made of 74% water, 10 to 12% lipids. Remember, most of that lipids is going to be the myelinated axons. And of course, it's also made of carbohydrates and proteins as well. So these are some general characteristics of the brain. And now the 4 principal structures that make up the brain. So today it's going to be mostly about the cerebrum, which you can see here, this wrinkly structure right here. Goes all the way around. You can see the blue right in front. That's the cerebrospinal fluid. So your cerebrum is basically floating in that cerebrospinal fluid that is between your skull, the bone up here, and then the blue, that's cerebrospinal fluid. So that's the cerebrum. Then you have what's called the diencephalon, which is made up of the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. To find the thalamus, it's always like right in the middle, and find this little, you can see this little bump right here, right there. That's called the interthalamic adhesion. All right, so here's the diencephalon. So here's your thalamus right here, this area right here. The hypothalamus, hypo means below, is right here, just below the thalamus. And that's going to control the pituitary gland right there. And then posterior and a little bit superior is called the epithalamus. And that's going to contain what's called the pineal gland that helps you go to sleep. Because it secretes melatonin, which some people take that as a supplement, melatonin, to help you go to sleep. But naturally, the pineal gland makes its own melatonin. You have the cerebellum, the little brain right here. It's the second largest structure in the brain to the cerebrum right there. And then you have the different parts of the brain stem. So you have what's called the midbrain, which is going to be just inferior to the thalamus, just posterior to the hypothalamus. You have right here this little bulging region. That's the pons right there. And the very bottom of the brainstem before it connects into the spinal cord is going to be the medulla oblongata. All right, so those are the 4 principal structures of the brain. All right, so here's some terms for you. The cerebrum is the largest structure of the brain. So here it is again, all of this green. That's all the cerebrum. Right here, once again, cerebellum, brainstem, diencephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus right there. All right, so the very outer, the most superficial region of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, and that is here in gray. It's made of gray matter. So it's the very, very outer, most superficial, very thin. It's only about 2 to 4 millimeters thick. If you don't know what that is, well, this rubber band right here is about 3 millimeters thick. So your cerebral cortex is about as thick as this rubber band right here. And then just below or deep to the cerebral cortex, the gray matter. Remember, it's gray matter because it's made of cell bodies, mostly cell bodies and possibly unmyelinated axons. And just deep to that, you get the white matter deep inside the brain. And that's white because it's made of myelinated axons, because that myelin is made of mostly lipids or fats. And some terms that describe the different features in the brain. First one is called gyri or gyrus. Gyri for plural, gyrus is for singular. And those are the ridges. Those are the high points in the brain. So kind of like your knuckles. You got high points and then you got little valleys. And the high points in the brain, the bumps, those are called a gyrus for singular, plural, gyri. Now, the little grooves, the little low points are right here, right there, and right there. Shallow grooves are called sulci for plural, or a sulcus for singular. So these would be sulci, plural, or each one of those would be a sulcus, the low parts, the little grooves. And then right here, there's a very deep groove. It's a very deep one. It's much deeper than these. These are shallower grooves. So the shallow ones are sulci or sulcus. And the deep ones are called fissures. So the gyri, those are the bumps. Sulcus, those are shallow grooves. And the very deep grooves are called fissures. And two of the ones you're going to need to know, the longitudinal fissure is going to go, it's just like a mid-sagittal cut. So it's going to be directly along the midline between the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. There's going to be a long longitudinal fissure there. And there's going to be a central sulcus. You'll definitely need to know that. It's going to be, there's a shallow groove that's going to separate the frontal lobe of the brain from the parietal lobe. And we'll go over that here in a little bit. And this kind of carries on from what the last slide was. So you can see the ridges right here. Those are the gyri, or each one's a gyrus. You can see the shallow grooves, the sulcus or sulci, and this very deep groove right here. That's a fissure. All right, so here's a picture of the brain looking down from superior. Here's a lateral view of the brain. All right, so right here, between the red and the blue, the red is the frontal lobe. Right here, you're going to have a shallow groove. That's called the central sulcus. Central sulcus right there. You can also see it right there. So the central sulcus is the boundary between the frontal lobe up here and the parietal lobe in blue. That's like the crown, or kind of like the top of your head. So separating them is the central sulcus. And you can also see here is the longitudinal fissure right down the middle. So here's the longitudinal fissure, a very deep groove, which is going to separate the right cerebral hemisphere over here from the left cerebral hemisphere over here. And before I leave the slide, I just want to show you one more time. So this is the central sulcus right here, shallow groove that separates the frontal lobe in red, parietal lobe in blue. But you can also see, so that's central sulcus, just anterior, just in front of the central sulcus, you have what's called the precentral gyrus. And that's right here. It's this bump just anterior to the central sulcus. And this is important because that's where your primary motor cortex is located, on the precentral gyrus, just in front of or anterior to the central sulcus. And that's where all of your voluntary movements originate. So if you want to move your arm, you want to move your hand, you want to move your legs, all those movements start right here in your primary motor cortex. And you can also see there's also a post-central gyrus, and that's right here, just behind or posterior to the central sulcus. That's going to be important because that's the primary somatosensory cortex, or somatosensory area. So all the sensations you feel throughout your body, from your toes to your neck to your hands, everything, all that is going to end up right here. So this is the area of the brain where that sensory information is going to come up through the spinal cord, and it's going to connect with the primary somatosensory cortex. So that's what allows you to feel different types of stimulation throughout the body. And the four main lobes that make up your cerebrum. First one is your frontal lobe. That's where voluntary movements, remember, that's where your primary motor area or primary motor cortex was located. It's also where your personality is stored, higher thinking skills, problem solving. So that's all going to be in the frontal lobe. Let's go back up here. So remember, the frontal lobe is here. It's in red. So just anterior, just in front of the central sulcus, there's your frontal lobe. And the next one's called your parietal lobe. Remember, that's where your primary somatosensory cortex is at. So that's sensory information where you can feel stuff like heat, cold, pain, touch, pressure, body position, and also some taste is located there in the parietal lobe. Another word for taste is gustatory system. So let's go ahead and look. Parietal lobe, just posterior to the central sulcus, so it's going to be here in blue. All this in blue, that's your parietal lobe. That's sensory. So this what allows you to detect various physical stimuli around the body. So there's your parietal lobe. And the next one is temporal lobe. It's for hearing, primary auditory cortex located in the temporal lobe. Taste, remember that's gustatory area. Smell, so olfactory. So your sense of smell comes from your nose and it's going to connect with your temporal lobe. And also some speech and language. All right, so let's see where that's at. Here's your temporal lobes on the side of your cerebrum. So right here in purple, that's all the temporal lobe right there. And the last one is the occipital lobe. And occipital lobe is for vision. All right, so occipital lobe is in the very back. So visual stimulation is going to go in the eyes, then through the optic nerve, it's going to travel to the back of the cerebrum back here. And this is where visual stimuli, different shapes, colors, recognizing faces, that's all going to happen back here in the occipital lobe. And just a diagram of the left cerebral hemisphere. So once again, here's your central sulcus, shallow groove, separates the frontal lobe here in pink and the parietal lobe here in blue. And don't forget that just in front of, or anterior to the central sulcus right here is the precentral gyrus, a bump gyrus. Precentral gyrus, that is where the primary motor cortex is located. So all your voluntary skeletal muscle movements will originate right here in your primary motor cortex. And just posterior to the central sulcus right here, you have the postcentral gyrus. Remember, a gyrus is a bulge or a bump where the sulcus or sulci are the shallow grooves. And remember, the fissures are the deep grooves. But the postcentral gyrus, that's where your primary somatosensory cortex is located. So all the sensory information from all throughout your body is going to wind up here in this region of the brain. And then just looking at the actual brain over here, it's kind of hard sometimes to find exactly. We're going to say the central sulcus is right here. It's hard to tell. I mean, a lot of them look the same. So here would be your frontal lobe right here in red. There's your frontal lobe just anterior to the central sulcus. Then you're going to have the parietal lobe, which is going to go, it's behind, posterior to the central sulcus. It's going to go down to around in here. So that'd be your parietal lobe. Your temporal lobe is going to be right here, just inferior to the frontal lobe and to the parietal lobe right there. Remember, that's hearing, some taste. And in the very back, we got the occipital lobe. This is for vision, recognizing shapes, recognizing faces, recognizing colors. So right here, there's your occipital lobe. And don't forget, down here you have the mini brain, the cerebellum. We'll go over its function in a future lecture. And then down here you have the three parts of the brain stem. Remember, it goes midbrain is the most superior or on the top. Then you have the pons in the middle, and the medulla oblongata is the most inferior or bottom, where that's where it's going to end up going into the spinal cord. And now the three different regions of the cerebrum. So Two of these we've kind of already done. Cerebral cortex, the superficial region. It's out here. It's the most superficial, closest to the surface of the skin. Very thin layer of gray matter. It is gray because it contains mostly neuronal cell bodies, possibly unmyelinated axons. Now, located deep to the cerebral cortex, you have the white matter down here. Right, so this is white because it's made of mostly myelinated axons. Now, I want to add something here real quick. So these bundles of myelinated axons, if it's inside the central nervous system, so inside the CNS, those are going to be called tracks. Tracks. So if it's inside this, if it's bundles of myelinated axons, white matter, inside the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, it's called a tract. But if it's in the peripheral nervous system, outside the brain and spinal cord, it's no longer called a tract. Now it's called a nerve. All right, so white matter inside the CNS, those are tracts. And in the peripheral nervous system, those are called nerves. And the third major region of the cerebrum is called basal nuclei. Now that's an interesting term because look, you can see over here it's called basal ganglia. Ganglia is more commonly used, but nuclei is a more accurate description of it. All right, so once again, we have the thin layer of gray matter making up the cerebral cortex, made up of mostly neuron cell bodies. Then we have the white matter located deep to that, made of mostly myelinated axons. And then within, there's islands of gray matter. So these are clusters of cell bodies, once again, located deep within the white matter. So like right here, this is the thalamus. So these are all different parts of the basal nuclei or basal ganglia. You got the caudate nucleus over here, the putamen, globus pallidus, substantia nigra, subthalamus nucleus right here. We're going to go over all those, so you don't need to know those right now. But just know the basal nuclei are clusters of cell bodies located deep within the cerebrum. But I wanted to point something out before I take off. Now, the reason why nuclei is more accurate is because of this. So, clusters of neuron cell bodies inside the central nervous system are called nuclei or nucleus for plural. So a cluster of neuron cell bodies within the brain or spinal cord, it's called a nuclei, plural, or nucleus. But if it's outside, if it's in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of neuron cell bodies, if you remember from our first lecture, uh, sensory information comes through the back of the spinal cord. So the sensory neurons come through the back of the spinal cord, and just before it enters the spinal cord, there's a bulge there in the nerve, and it's a bunch of neuron cell bodies. Since it's just out of the spinal cord, just out of the central nervous system, it's called a ganglion. Ganglion or ganglia for plural. So that's why this is kind of weird because they call it basal ganglia, but it shouldn't be ganglia because this is inside the brain. So it should be called basal nuclei. So if you see basal ganglia or basal nuclei, it means the same thing, but basal nuclei is a more accurate term. And the functions of some of these cerebral cortex regions of the cerebral cortex. So the first one was the primary somatosensory area or the primary somatosensory cortex. If you remember, here's your brain, the mid-sagittal cut. So here's your frontal lobe, here's your parietal lobe, here's the central sulcus. So it's going to be located on the post-central gyrus right here. This little bump that's just posterior to the central sulcus. So right here, this is the post-central gyrus. This is where your primary somatosensory cortex is located. Remember, this is where all the sensations throughout the body, touch, pain, temperature, proprioception. That's where like I can close my eyes. And I know my hand's right there. It's right there because I have sensors in my body that allows my brain to know where my body is at in space. What else? Accuracy of sensations. So like if I feel a mosquito biting me, boom, I know exactly where to swat because that region is arriving at my primary somatosensory area. And I'm going to show you one more thing before I move on. There's different regions. So the somatosensory area, different spots of this is devoted to different parts of the body. And let me show you something real quick. All right, this kind of weird diagram right here is called a homunculus for the somatosensory cortex. So it shows you, it's like a map. So you can see on the very top right here, so that'd be like right here, that specific area of the primary somatosensory cortex is for your hip or for your knee right there. So if you put a little electrode right there and shock this part of the brain, you'd be like, oh, my knee hurts. You wouldn't feel it in your brain because this little area of your somatosensory cortex is devoted to your knee. But look, see how your fingers and your hands have a very large area of the somatosensory cortex devoted to your fingers and hands because that's what you're doing most of your feeling with. You're doing your fine motor, fine touching. If you ever want to, feel if something's soft, you very rarely use your elbow or your knee, but you use your hands a lot. So things that require a lot of fine touch is going to have a larger area, larger representation in the primary somatosensory cortex. And the next one is the primary visual area or the primary visual cortex. Remember, that's going to be the very back in the occipital lobe back here. That's for recognizing shapes, faces, colors. Primary auditory area is going to be right here in your temporal lobe. So this is hearing. So stimulation from your ears is going to end up right here in your temporal lobe. Primary motor area. Remember, that's very close to the primary somatosensory cortex. So the central sulcus right here again, primary motor area, primary motor cortex is on the precentral gyrus. And that's where all your conscious movements, skeletal movements, that's where they're going to originate. And I'm going to show you one more thing on that homunculus real quick. And once again, here's the central sulcus right here, the shallow groove. On top, that'll be the frontal lobe. So right here, here's the precentral gyrus right here in pink. So that's where the primary motor cortex is located. And here's the homunculus for the primary motor cortex. So the different regions of the motor cortex that's devoted to different regions of the body. And once again, you can see the hands have a very large area in the primary motor cortex because you're using your hands all the time. You're using it to text. You're using it to type, to throw things, to hold things. Your hands are used all the time. Look at your trunk, basically from your neck all the way to your waist. Very little region of the primary motor cortex is devoted to the trunk because what do you do with your waist other than doing like sit-ups? You don't do much with it. And also your feet. You don't do as many things with your feet as you do with your hands and also your mouth. It takes a lot of area in the primary motor cortex in order to control your mouth because it takes very fine movements of the mouth in order to create words. So things that need more precise movements are going to have a much larger area devoted to them on the primary motor cortex. And the last cerebral cortex functional area is called Broca's speech area or the motor speech area. It's on the left hemisphere, so here's your left cerebral hemisphere. Once again, here's the central sulcus, and Broca's area is going to be right about there, just anterior, kind of like at the bottom of the primary motor cortex. And that's for speech production. So that's like what I'm doing right now. I'm using Broca's area to produce speech. So people that have damage in Broca's area, they're able to understand speech when someone's talking to them, but they're unable to produce their own speech. So they're unable to form sentences, put sentences together to talk. And that's called non-fluent aphasia because you're non-fluent because you're unable to communicate. All right, now three other functional areas of the cerebral cortex. I've never heard it called this, but the anterior association area. Usually that's called the prefrontal cortex. So it's going to be the very, very front of the frontal lobe. So this is for higher level intellectual reasoning, problem solving, socially acceptable behavior. So this is like impulse control. So if your prefrontal lobe isn't fully developed, you have trouble with controlling your impulses. So when you're young, maybe you do some really crazy, silly things that when you get older, you're like, I really don't need to be doing that. Then they have what's called here the posterior association area, typically called the visual association area. So we're going back here to the occipital lobe. So the primary visual cortex right here in the very back of the occipital lobe, just anterior to that is the visual association area or posterior association area. And that's where it's gonna look more in depth on the shapes and the colors that you're looking at. So maybe you see a face and that is registered right here from the eyes to the primary visual cortex. When it goes to the association area, maybe you recognize, oh, that's Abraham Lincoln's face. So it's more deciphering and more figuring out what the visual stimuli is that's coming into your occipital lobe from the eyes. And the last one is just called the speech area. I'm going to add something because this is called, so we had Broca's area. This is a different speech area called Wernicke's. Let's see if I know how to spell it. Uh, I think that's right. Wernicke's area. That's going to be right here. It's like the boundary between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. And if you remember, Broca's area was for speech production. So damage here in Broca's area means you cannot produce speech, you cannot talk. The opposite of that is Wernicke's area, right in this area right here. That's for speech comprehension. So if you have damage here, you can talk just fine. You can construct sentences. You can talk to somebody. Unfortunately, if you have damage right here, you can't comprehend speech, so you don't understand what somebody's telling you. So that would be called fluent aphasia. So if you have damage here, it's fluent aphasia because you can communicate, you can talk. You just have trouble understanding when someone talks back to you. And we finally made it to the last slide, and we're at about 26 minutes of this lecture. You remember what they call that in college, just getting started, just getting warmed up. All right, so remember, here is the central sulcus right here, the shallow groove in the brain that separates the frontal lobe in green and the parietal lobe in bluish purplish. Right here, remember, this bump right here, this gyrus is called the precentral gyrus. This is where your primary motor cortex is located. So this is what initiates all your skeletal muscle movements. Just posterior to the central sulcus, you have the post-central gyrus. Remember, this is where the primary somatosensory cortex is located, right here on this gyrus. So that's where all the sensory information from throughout the body is going to wind up on this gyrus in your brain to allow you to feel different types of stimulation at different locations of your body. Up here, remember, we have the prefrontal area right here. Higher level thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, impulse control. So this keeps you from doing risky behaviors once you get older. Over here, we got the primary auditory cortex right here. Auditory is for uh, sound stimulation. Auditory association area right here. It's basically the same as the visual association area. Here's Wernicke's area right here. Remember, this is for language or speech comprehension. So if someone's talking to you, it's this area right here, Wernicke's area, that deciphers what they're saying. So you can understand what these sentences mean. The other one was Broca's area up here, just anterior to the primary motor cortex. Remember, this is for speech production. So damage to Broca's area right here, you're able to comprehend speech. You can hear it. You can understand it. You're unable to produce your own speech. And back here, you got the primary visual cortex back here in the occipital lobe. And just anterior to that is the visual association area, which is going to look at those shapes and those figures and try to compare it with other shapes so you can figure out actually what it is. So this is just processing visual information back here. Taste/gustatory area. It has it right here on the primary somatosensory cortex, but it actually also goes into the temporal lobe. So the gustatory area is going to be kind of in the boundary between the parietal lobe, the somatosensory cortex, and it also goes into the temporal lobe. All right, so that is it for this lecture on the cerebrum. I'll see you in lecture 3 when we're going to be going over, I don't know, maybe the brainstem. Don't know what's coming next, but I'll see you in lecture 3.